All right. Welcome, everybody. We're just getting started. Need to mute my phone. All right. Looks like all the attendees are able to enter the room. You guys are able to see me and hear me? Someone can give me a hands up. All right. Super. Thank you for that. We'll give folks just another minute to go ahead and hop on in here. I see attendees are logging into the room. All right. Go ahead and share my screen and all right, fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to the Habitat and Wildlife Keepers December 2020 edition. Certainly would much prefer to have you guys in person in our room in the Matthews Community Center, but this is the second best way. So we have a exciting night with Jeff Hunter talking about fun wildlife crossings for us tonight. But in the meantime, you know, for those that of you that are coming from far away, it's one advantage of this is that folks are able to come and see us from far and wide. You know, we're an environmental group that go ahead and really focus on conservation and environmental education, teaching folks how to really take care of wildlife right there in their backyard. You know, the biggest and easiest thing to do is certifying your yard, which many of you probably already qualified for because it's providing four simple things: food, water, and shelter, and a place for wildlife to raise their young. Bird houses, bird baths, ponds, bird brush piles, things like that. And of course, food sources, different food, plants, berries, all of that fun stuff. And of course, using real gentle pest control, not blasting your yards and everybody else's with chemicals. 7 years ago, the town of Matthews became a certified community wildlife habitat. It was a big accomplishment, not only for the town of Matthews, but also for us helping them get there. And one of the ways is by getting a whole bunch of businesses and places of worship and schools and homes as certified wildlife habitats. You know, if you build it, they will come, and they certainly start off on the left here, real small. I imagine many of you know what kind of caterpillar this is. They only lay their eggs on milkweed, and if you said monarch butterfly, you are correct. That is the payoff to planting milkweed, and it is an easy plant to establish, and that is the only host plant for the monarch butterfly. So can't encourage you more to go ahead and get some milkweed in your yard. You know, another thing is I'm a big fan of being a lazy gardener, and so leaving the seed pods and leaving the stems and whatnot up and leaving the leaves on the ground, because that's where a lot of our little creatures overwinter. You know, if last month we had Dr. Doug Tallamy speak with us, and if you missed the presentation, we do have a replay link that's on YouTube. You can get it from our website, hawkncwf.org. And it's absolutely fantastic. So he talks a lot about that. And if you notice what's in the bird's mouth, that is a caterpillar. That is way more bird food than they use as far as seeds. So caterpillars and soft insects, that's what we need in our yards to help the birds. This is a beautiful way to go ahead and do that. This is actually from Kim O'Shea's backyard. She was a presenter for us just a year or so ago. That has got plenty of wildlife, including that little guy off to the right, coming to enjoy. You know, we've had presentations on owls, and this picture always cracks me up. I did not know they had that much fluff and such long legs. And talking about owls, now is a great time to put an owl box up in your tree. Barred owls are, this doesn't happen to be a barred owl, but barred owls are going to be nesting here shortly. So if you haven't gotten that perfect holiday gift for somebody, get them a barred owl box and get it put up in a tree for them. So in Jeff's honor, I picked that great dancing bear picture. Our January 5th presentation is going to be living with bears. Kim Delozier is going to go ahead and tell us all about that. So look forward to you guys joining us for that as well. You know, we're a volunteer organization, and we could use your help. Even though Kids in Nature Day with Earth Day was canceled this year, a lot of activities have been, and certainly our meetings in person are canceled. We could still use folks to help us with all sorts of stuff. We have pollinator gardens over at Squirrel Lake Park, where this organization got started. We'd love to have you come and join us. So reach out to us through our website, through our Facebook page, and let us know how little or how much you'd like to assist. We've got some great sponsors. Birdhouse on the Greenway and Wildology do a wonderful job in helping us with our bird feeders at Squirrel Lake Park. In fact, I was talking about owl boxes, great places to get owl boxes. Williams Subaru has been a sponsor of our Earth Day celebration for over 5 years now. And we're looking forward to next year when they can sponsor our Earth Day celebration again. So tonight, we have a special guest, Jeff Hunter, who's going to talk with us about wildlife crossings. He's a senior program manager with the National Parks Conservation Association. And he works on issues related to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Blue Ridge Parkway, and Appalachian Trail too. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing him again. I saw and met him a couple of years ago. I think you guys are in for a treat, and please do put in any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and I look forward to getting all those answered. So without further ado, Jeff, go ahead and grab the screen sharing, and pass it off to you.
Thank you, Dan, and good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. Does that look good? Do you see, let me see, start the presentation. What do you see?
We still see your notes.
Look good now?
Perfect.
Okay, well, greetings from snowy Yancey County, North Carolina, home to Mount Mitchell State Park, North Carolina's first state park. It's been snowing on and off here all day. We've got a couple of inches, so winter is nearly upon us. Really appreciate the opportunity to interact with y'all, and I hope we'll have some questions. I don't want to do all the talking. I want to thank Dan for scheduling Kim Delozier next month, because he's a tough act to follow. Kim's a friend of mine and someone who I collaborate with quite a bit. In fact, Dan, I believe when you and I met, Kim and I were presenting in Raleigh. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I serve as a facilitator for. It's the Pigeon River Gorge I-40 Wildlife Connectivity Collaborative. It's one of the cooler projects I've ever had the honor of working on, and I hope you find this presentation interesting. Before I start the presentation, let me just tell you a little bit about my employer, National Parks Conservation Association. So we were founded in 1919, so we're 101 years old. We advocate to protect and enhance America's national parks for present and future generations. And I spent 4.5 hours today on our National Wildlife Team virtual retreat, where I was interacting with some of my colleagues who are working on issues in Alaska, folks who helped stop the pebble mine, which would potentially have impacted wildlife and in the Bristol Bay headwaters in Alaska, folks who are working on reintroducing grizzly bear in the Pacific Northwest and North Cascades National Park, folks that were involved in reintroducing wolves on Isle Royale and Lake Superior, and a number of other projects. So it's we're not just focused here in the Southeast, we do work nationally. So the issue that we're talking about tonight is roads and wildlife. If any of you have ever driven I-40 all the way west across the state into Tennessee, you have passed through the Pigeon River Gorge, which is a windy 2-lane each direction road, cuts through public lands in the form of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, and in Tennessee, the Cherokee National Forest, just outside the boundaries of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So roads themselves have a huge impact on wildlife. It's estimated somewhere between 1 and 2 million large animals are killed every year on roads. We really don't know what that number is for a variety of reasons. Here is a dead black bear on the side of I-40. One of the challenges we have is that people will pick up these animals for food, perhaps for parts. They disappear. They'll get hit sometimes in the road, and the 26,000 vehicles a day, those carcasses don't last very long. We're talking about billions of dollars in property damage, tens of thousands of human injuries, and more than 200 human fatalities annually as a result of wildlife vehicle collisions. Recently, North Carolina DOT did a statewide study for a 3-year period, 2017 through 2019. The source of this data is police reports, highway patrol. So anytime someone hit an animal and did not call the police, it's not included in these numbers. So this is a low ball number on the number of collisions. We're talking about somewhere on the order of almost 57,000 wildlife vehicle collisions over 3 years, $156 million in property damage, 5 human fatalities in North Carolina as a result of wildlife vehicle collisions. So this is not just a wildlife issue, it's also a safety issue, and we're trying to make things better for wildlife and for humans in the Pigeon River Gorge. So how do you avoid collisions? There's a number of ways to do it. One of the ways to do it is through infrastructure, green infrastructure. This is a photograph from Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada, of a wildlife overpass and over the Trans-Canada Highway, which passes through the park. And these are very successful if they're built in the right location and they're paired with fencing to funnel animals to the crossing. This animals, first of all, didn't evolve with roads. This road, like I-40, is fairly new. Wildlife has been moving across these landscapes for millennia. If you restore those linkages, the adult animals will teach the young to use these crossings. And over the course of several generations, they can become very, very effective. But in addition to overpasses, underpasses are another possibility. This is a couple of structures at, again, Banff National Park. You can see the fencing. These are elk, and we do have elk on the landscape here in Western North Carolina. They do like big, larger open structures. They won't use smaller culverts. It needs to, they won't walk on rocks. They generally won't walk through a culvert that's moving water. That's not a hard and fast rule, but the bigger the opening, the better when you're talking about elk. So here in North Carolina, if you've traveled US 64 to the Outer Banks, you have crossed 3 wildlife crossing structures. And a big shout out to our partners at the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. They have a memorandum of understanding with NCDOT, and they are monitoring these structures to make sure that the fencing is intact so animals can't actually escape and get out on the roadway. Yeah, North Carolina it is. Why Interstate 40 in the Pigeon Gorge? Why are we focusing here? Why aren't we focusing other places? Fact of the matter is there are more black bears in eastern North Carolina than there are in western North Carolina. There's more mortality in eastern North Carolina than there is in western North Carolina. But take a look at that landscape. We're talking about a very rugged and wild landscape. Our focal species are 3 different critters: bear, black bear, elk, and white-tailed deer. This roadway was built and opened in 1968, so that's nearly 53 years ago. Let's go back 53 years in time and think about what this landscape was like. First of all, there were no elk. They had been extirpated for nearly 200 years at that point in time. They didn't exist on the landscape. Bears were a fraction of the population that we have now. There's an estimated 1,900 black bears in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Back in the late 60s, there's probably a couple hundred. So the possibility of running into these animals is great. One of the issues we're dealing with is climate. So if you've researched and read anything about climate, you understand that wildlife is moving towards the poles. They're trying to find a climate envelope suitable for them. This is a hard barrier in the southern Appalachian Mountains. So if we're able to restore some landscape connectivity from one side of the highway to the other, it will not only benefit our 3 focal species, but it will benefit a whole variety of species, including things like bobcat, red fox, gray fox, even herps like turtles and snakes and possibly salamanders. This is, of course, is one of the epicenters of biodiversity for all kinds of critters, in particular for salamanders. So another thing, what is the value of an elk alive? Great Smoky Mountains National Park is an absolute economic juggernaut for western North Carolina and communities like Bryson City and Maggie Valley, as well as East Tennessee for communities like Gatlinburg, Townsend. And in 2019, Maggie Valley held the first ever Smoky Mountain Elk Fest. Wildlife brings, tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people to this community every year to see these animals alive. This photograph you're looking at is the Cataloochee Valley, where elk were reintroduced in 2001, 2002. It's the least visited part of the most visited national park in the country. So what are we talking about in terms of our project area? We're looking at 28 miles of highway corridor on Interstate 40. So to orient you in North Carolina from the state line right here where the Appalachian Trail crosses under the highway at Waterville Road out to the Maggie Valley exit where you would get to Cataloochee. And in the Tennessee side of the border, we have from the state line to where the Foothills Parkway ties in, 8 miles in Tennessee and 20 miles in North Carolina for a total of 28 miles of highway that we're looking at. So if you look at this map was produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administered SECUS project, and that's SECUS stands for Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. This has to do with climate. And you can see our study area is right here, and the darker the area, the higher the conservation value. Very important to keep these mountains connected so that critters can actually move from the south to the north, which is what they're doing right now. This is a collaborative project. As I said, I'll talk about some of our collaborators in just a moment. But one of the project partners is Wildlands Network, and they have also done a lot of mapping. Again, here's our project area in the Smokies, and they have mapped important connectivity priorities the entire East Coast. And you can see right here is super important to keep this area connected to large landscapes, intact landscapes, many of them to the north of the park. So the next slide is going to show you in 16 seconds, probably more about this project than I can say in 25 minutes or half an hour. It was shot in August of 2017, and it shows two things. In our project area, first of all, about mile marker 2 in North Carolina, it's going to show you the peril to wildlife, and it's going to show you the public safety issue with cars at a dead standstill on a busy interstate. So that's a female with 1, 2,
Come on, baby.
Go on.
3 cubs. There's always one straggler in every family, right?
There we go.
So that was shot by Susan Detweiler. It doesn't always end that well. We have a lot of mortality on I-40, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we move along. So let's turn away from American black bear for a second and talk about another critter, charismatic megafauna, elk. This photograph was taken by Michael Egan. He's an environmental professional. As I mentioned, elk were reintroduced in the Smokies in 2001, 2002, about 50 animals. Population is estimated now at about 150 animals. No one seems to know exactly how many there are. So there is a research project right now where researchers are collecting scat in and around the park, and they're able to analyze that DNA and get down to the individual animal. And the hope is to count them. Regarding elk and roadways, a bull elk can run over 1,000 pounds. So it's one thing to run into a white-tailed deer. It's another thing to run into a black bear. It's a whole nother kettle of fish to run into an elk. That could easily result in a human fatality. So when we first started this project in 2017, I called around to government agencies, including the National Park Service, the Forest Service, 2 wildlife agencies in Tennessee and North Carolina, a lot of nonprofit organizations, and about 21 different organizations gathered in my office to talk about this issue. And we were focused on black bear. That was our focus at the time. But we understood that elk were now on both sides of the highway, and we wanted to proactively get out in front of the issue with elk. Well, since then, we have had a young bull elk that was hit and struck on I-40 a couple miles west of the North Carolina-Tennessee border. This is actually in Tennessee. This is the animal. It actually got down to the Pigeon River. Sadly, a couple of its legs were broken, so it had to be euthanized by a National Park Service wildlife technician. Thankfully, no one was hurt in that collision. But here's another photo for you. This is a photograph of a vehicle that struck one of our research animals, a collared elk, near Murphy, North Carolina. Again, no humans were killed in this crash, but the elk had to be euthanized. So these elk are ranging far and wide, especially the young bulls. They disperse and try to colonize new territory and look for mates. So I showed you a map earlier of the landscape we're looking at. We're dealing with 2 states, North Carolina and Tennessee. So we have 2 departments of transportation that are involved, the TDOT in Tennessee and NCDOT in North Carolina. We have the Federal Highways Administration involved. We have 2 wildlife agencies, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, the Park Service, the Forest Service, and lots of other nonprofits. And we also have Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians involved. So it's federal, state, tribal, and non-governmental organizations coming together to try to make a change on a multi-jurisdictional landscape. So each year since we first met in 2017, we have had a field trip. This year was the exception because of the pandemic. And here we are gathered at the North Carolina Exit 7 Harmon-Den. There's Dr. Liz Rutledge from North Carolina Wildlife Federation right there in the middle. Hugh Irwin with the Wilderness Society, Ron Sutherland with the Wilderness Society. We have folks from the Forest Service, National Park Service, that's Joe Yarkovich. There's probably 25 people here altogether, and they're listening to Tony Clevenger, who's a road ecologist. He got his master's at the University of Tennessee studying black bear in the Cherokee National Forest, and subsequently got his PhD in Spain. And he's one of the foremost experts on mitigating wildlife issues. And we brought him in, and he's been consulting with us periodically. In 2018, we had the Federal Highways Administration come down and co-facilitate a 2-day wildlife crossing workshop in Maggie Valley. Outstanding. This is Dr. Joe Clark. He works for USGS and is based in Knoxville on the campus of the University of Tennessee. He's leading that elk DNA project I mentioned earlier. This is a former colleague of mine, Don Barter, who retired recently at NPCA, Tracy Davids with Defenders of Wildlife, another colleague of mine here. This woman, I believe, is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I don't know who's got their hand on their head here, but suffice to say, this is one breakout group after this 2-day workshop, and it really shined a light on the issues and how you can affect change. And quite frankly, we're starting to change hearts and minds in a number of agencies, and that's really, really exciting. So let me delve into our research just a little bit. We, in early 2019, started a research project. Our overall goal was to identify key areas and strategies for mitigating wildlife-human conflict. So the wildlife issue and the safety issue. And we have 3 objectives: to assess wildlife road mortality patterns in the gorge, where a thing is getting hit and killed, to assess wildlife use of existing structures. There are some box culverts and metal culverts. We wanted to see, is wildlife using those things? We wanted to see what the amount of wildlife activity was within the highway right-of-way adjacent to I-40. And then lastly, to utilize GPS collars to track elk movements with respect to the highway. And there are 3 key partners in this: my organization, NPCA, Wildlands Network, and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So really exciting stuff. So what are we finding? What are we learning? Well, first of all, let me show you a preliminary mortality hotspot map. Okay, what we're seeing is really interesting. First of all, here in green, you have national forest lands. Okay, and this is the Pisgah National Forest right here. This is the Cherokee National Forest, and over here. So here's North Carolina. See this big red spot here? This is a 4.6 mile hotspot. And what's interesting is we're seeing the most mortality clearly associated with public lands. So outside of this hotspot, this is a mosaic of private lands. It's mostly private lands, fairly close to the national park. This is the Smokies, this big blue area here. So it's telling us that even though we're studying from Maggie Valley all the way to the state line, really the big problem we're seeing is right in here. One of our challenges when we first started this project was the mortality data for our project area was scattered across a variety of agencies. North Carolina DOT had some, North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission had some, Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency had some, TDOT had some. We wanted to gather all that data together, take a look at it, and then start regular surveys to see what is out there. And in 2 years, what we've learned is that the mortality we're seeing in the last 2 years is 5.6 times higher than what was recorded in the prior 18 years, meaning annually we're seeing nearly 6 times as much mortality as had been recorded historically. That's clearly showing that the stuff was undercounted. Mind you, we don't know what gets hit and runs off into the woods and dies unless we happen to stumble across an animal when we're in the woods doing some research. So even the numbers that we have here are likely low. Now, one thing I want to show you, see, we've got this cool spot right here, right? Not much mortality here, and there's a reason for that. That's where I-40 goes through the mountain. They tunnel through the mountain. And this is a land bridge that functions very much like a wildlife overpass, and wildlife are using it. Back in September of 2016, when this project was in its infancy, I got up on this area here above the highway, and immediately I found just a maze of wildlife trails, bear scat, all kinds of sign. And in fact, subsequently, we have learned that wildlife is using it extensively. Not elk, but bobcat, coyote, bear, long-tailed weasels, spotted skunks, and much, much more. So one of the tools that we utilize are these game cameras. We use Reconyx Hyperfire cameras. I want to give a shout out to the Wildlife Resource Commission. They have loaned us initially 56 cameras that were acquired initially for a spotted skunk study. The remaining cameras were provided by my organization, by Wild Dance Network, and through generous grants from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, another partner. And so you can see the proximity to the roadway, and we're trying to see what's approaching the road. Our second research objective is to assess the use of existing structures. And here is a young bull elk in October of this year. We were very excited to see this animal use a box culvert, and I don't have the video from the other side of the culvert, but it did actually go through to the other side. These animals are looking for the path of least resistance. They are ridge runners and gap crossers, and if they can save some energy as they move across the landscape to find resources and mates and shelter, they'll do so. And we also, I mentioned we have some culverts that pass water. I didn't have the animated GIF here, but this was a really cool series of photos that we acquired at one of our sites. This is the adult. She jumped up there. She flashed her tail at her kitten, and the kitten jumped up, you know, hang in there, baby. And she made it, and they passed through to the other side. So they're not totally averse to water, believe it or not. We also, our third objective is to assess wildlife activity within the highway right-of-way. And this is a young black bear. This is typical fencing along I-40. One thing this tells us is this was not designed to keep black bear away from the highway. And in fact, if you're going to put fencing up, which is essential with wildlife crossing structures, you need to bury the fence because these bears are pretty smart and they can climb right under. So I mentioned earlier the elk collar project. That's where the North Carolina Wildlife Federation is quite involved with Wild Dance Network. And so working with the Wildlife Resource Commission and the National Park Service, about 12 elk were immobilized and collared. And then these collars actually send out data points every couple of hours, but there's an invisible fence. When the animals get close to the highway, it sends out a location every 20 minutes. And so there's one particular female that spent a lot of time here in the Cataloochee Valley, and she made a beeline and she's hanging out near I-40, and eventually she crossed the highway at grade with a calf. And the only reason she's still with us is that she did it in the middle of the night. Now you can notice there's a red cross here, an X mark, and that's where that elk was killed earlier that I showed you. Interestingly, this cow crosses and hangs out with her calf over here on the Tennessee side, and she actually came back and crossed under the Waterville Bridge where the Appalachian Trail crosses under the highway, just like the hikers do. So she doesn't only go at grade, sometimes she does use the crossing structures. So the project itself was a long-term research project, and last year, in May of last year, we were doing a panel discussion in Waynesville in Haywood County. A wildlife biologist for NCDOT was on the panel, my colleague Steve Goodman with NPCA, and Liz Hillard with Wild Dance Network. And NCDOT announced, oh, we're going to replace 5 bridges in the project area in the next 5 years. And that was a revelation. It's also an opportunity. Why is it an opportunity? Because these bridges are not going to be replaced until another 50 to 75 years. So if we can put some wildlife passage considerations into the reconstruction of these structures, it'll benefit wildlife for a lifetime. Now, regarding the bridges, this is what some of them look like underneath. They are structurally sound, but they do absolutely need to be replaced. So we started advocating with the DOT to, in addition to replacing these structures, to actually incorporate wildlife passage. One of the things that my organization did is we hired Terry McGuire, who is the chief engineer that built the wildlife passage structures in Banff National Park. And we had him come down and consult. He's one of the foremost experts on this issue, on wildlife passage in North America. And he's also an engineer and speaks the language of the DOT, and that's super important. Early on, I was told that wildlife biologists deal in probability and engineers deal in certainty. And when you bring those folks together to try to communicate, sometimes you'll have a chasm. So it's really important to understand what each other is talking about. And since we started this project in 2017, we've been building trust amongst ourselves and building a community that's solution oriented. So we're seeking that win-win for wildlife and for people. Here is the Waterville Bridge, which is, if you're going from Charlotte to Knoxville, just as you cross into Tennessee, the Waterville Bridge is there, and you can see the white blaze for the Appalachian Trail right here. And here is our cow elk using this structure right down the middle of the road. Less than ideal, but better than crossing at grade where she could get killed. As an aside, it's pretty cool because 20 years ago in 2000, I walked the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine. And so here I am 20 years later working on this landscape. I remember the day I crossed under I-40 quite well to this day. So the collaborative group, which includes a number of folks, including Dr. Rutledge with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, Bill Holman with the Conservation Fund, Ben Prater from Defenders, myself, and Steve Goodman from NPCA, and Dr. Ron Sutherland with Wildlands Network. We provided comments on all 5 bridges, what we thought that DOT could do to make these structures better for wildlife. In the case of what we call the High Bridge, which crosses over White Oak Road, it's a very tall structure. One of the things we're asking is to not mess that up. It's open enough where wildlife can cross under there. So in that case, we don't want them to really make it worse. In the case of Harmon Den, which I'll be talking more about, there are a lot of things that can be done, and I'll focus on that in just a little bit. Well, let's go to Harmon Den right now. So if some of you have driven I-40 to go to Appalachian Trail at a place called Max Patch, which is a grassy bald where you have a 360-degree panorama. You can see the Black Mountains from there. That's the Black Mountains from near where I live, and look south to the Smokies. Really beautiful. This is one of the exits you can get off. For context, okay, here is the Harmon Den Bridge. Cold Springs Creek flows out of the forest over here. And under here, this is a body of water where trout are stocked, and it's often fished by locals. Right as it crosses under I-40, it enters the Pigeon River here. We've had otters, a family of 5 otters we captured actually on our cameras. For context, the Harmon Den Wildlife Management Area is just east of this location, and this whole entire area here is a black bear sanctuary, right up against the highway. So that really calls to question, can we make this better for wildlife? I'm going to go back to this map for a second and show you, here's Harmon Den, just a couple of miles from what we call the double tunnel, with that essentially a wildlife passage structure on top. What we want to see is more cool spots on this map in the future. We want blue, we don't want red. Red means mortality, blue means no mortality or low mortality. And we can get there. It's going to take some investment. It's going to take some dedication, but we can indeed get there. So this blue arrow shows you, again, Harmon Den. It also shows you a GPS track of a cow elk in 2015 that came out of Cataloochee Valley, and look, she crossed right under I-40. So how did the elk get to the other side? They got there under Harmon Den. In 2017, one of the impetuses for this project was the Forest Service announced they were going to do a project called the 12-mile project. This is the 12-mile strip in here between the park and the highway. They're going to do a lot of logging to create new openings for wildlife. Wildlife openings are very beneficial for a wide variety of animals, including bear and elk and white-tailed deer. But they also indicated they were going to do the same thing on the other side of the highway. So Kim DeLozier, your speaker next month, Hugh Irwin with the Wilderness Society, and myself, and a colleague at Defenders of Wildlife attended some public meetings, and we all said, time out. If you're going to do this, you need to think about how the wildlife are going to respond, because we do not want elk in the road. Let's take another look at Harmon Den so you get an idea of the topography. Why is this site important? Well, I mentioned Cold Spring Creek, and here's the creek corridor. A Forest Service road follows that, and this is a really important movement area for wildlife. This is Harmon Den Mountain, and critters come and go using this system. On the other side of the road, we have Long Arm Mountain, which comes out of the park and has some spur ridges, and wildlife use those ridges to move about. This is a recent photo taken at Harmon Den. What you're looking at here is a box culvert where Cold Spring Creek goes under the eastbound exit ramp at Harmon Den, and this bear is probably 100 yards from I-40. Give you an idea, this is the location right here. So here's the bridge that's going to be replaced, here's the highway, and this is where this animal is. Notice this big area here that's denuded. This is an area where, I guess 8 or 9 years ago, there was a huge rock slide that closed I-40 for 9 months. That's where it was. So there's some unstable geology here. That's another issue we're dealing with. And that's what that spot actually looks like. You can see this tree is in fact that tree. We've got some photos of all kinds of critters here, including the occasional great blue heron fishing right there in Cold Spring Creek. So I'm giving this presentation to you, but this issue has been in the news quite a bit. The first time it appeared in the news was January 6, 2019, when Karen Chavez with the Asheville Citizen-Times did a feature story that appeared on the front page of the Sunday paper. It was an in-depth story that interviewed a whole number of our stakeholders and really created quite a buzz. Great Smoky Mountains Association did this article here, Right of Way, which was a feature with lots of photographs. This picture of these bears, by the way, was taken in Virginia, not in our project area, but it shows just how intelligent they are. Here's the female. She's up on the guardrail. She's looking, and she's got 3 cubs that want to get to the other side for food, for shelter, for safety. The issue's been on television in the Knoxville market. WBIR has done some real features. You can Google this, Bridges for Bears could reduce I-40 wildlife death trap. It's a 4-minute and 40-second TV feature. What's neat about this is, first of all, nobody wants to hit an animal with their car, right? So this is a very popular issue, whether, regardless of your political stripe, if you're left, if you're right, if you're a centrist, if you're a conservative, if you're a liberal, people don't want to hit animals with their cars. So there aren't many people who are opposed to this. I haven't met any yet personally myself. We also were contacted by PBS, and PBS has a program called Eco Sense for Living. And earlier this year, there was a program entitled Wild Crossings, which aired nationally, and you can Google that and find that as well. Lastly, this is really important. one of our partners, Frances Feigart from Great Smoky Mountains Association, she's so passionate. She's a great writer and an editor. She got this idea to write a children's book. And this children's book, A Search for Safe Passage, is going to be published this spring. It actually, the book anthropomorphizes the animals. The animals speak, but what's really neat, in the back of the book, we explain to the young readers about anthropomorphism, that how animals don't speak, but for the purposes of this article, this publication, that's what we did. And then there are in-depth features on about 20 different species of animals, so that young people can learn about the life history, the natural history of the various critters that move across this landscape. Oh, speaking of critters, we got our first armadillos on camera recently, so they're coming, folks. If they're not to you yet, they will be in another decade or so. They're on their way. So what are we asking the DOT to do at Harmon-Den? Well, we want fencing so that we can funnel animals through here. We want some attractive vegetation that'll bring them through. We want to have some benches where they can safely move here, maybe some cattle guards so elk don't come and walk up the entrance ramps and get on the highway and get killed. In the last 3 weeks, we've had dead bears here, and here. There was a young cub that was hit here most recently. So we do see a lot of mortality here. Removing the grass so that we don't have attractants, so the animals don't stop to graze, they just move right on through. So, and also some escape ramps, because should they get past the fencing and find themselves in here, we need an area where they can actually jump out and safely get off the highway. So it's a project that is long-term. This is a short-term opportunity that's presented itself at Harmon-Den, but in the long term, what we're hoping to do is to make a case for building one or more wildlife overpasses and perhaps some underpasses, expanding smaller structures to allow wildlife to move under the highway, or those larger structures to allow critters to move over the highway. It's something that is going to take some advocacy down the line. I don't have an action for y'all to take right now, but I can promise you that we can stay in touch, and North Carolina Wildlife Federation is involved. And as opportunities come up for you to raise your voice and speak out for wildlife, we hope you'll do that, because it does actually take everybody to speak up. These are public lands, public dollars will be expended, and we want to make sure those dollars are used wisely. So that is the presentation that I have for this evening. I'm certainly happy to entertain any questions. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but
Jeff, we did have a question that wasn't in the Q&A. We've got a couple actually that came
great.
to outside of that. And so at this point, how many, you talked about crossing structures, not necessarily just an overpass or an underpass. How many crossing structures or locations are there in that small section of highway that you were talking about?
I don't actually have a number for you. My research biologist, Steve Goodman, probably has that number in his hip pocket or in his head. We have, some of the important structures in Tennessee. There's a place called the Bluffton Bridge, which is a very high bridge over the Pigeon River, and that's an important area. Our mortality heat map is showing in Tennessee. That's a spot where we get a lot of animals that get hit, but we also get a lot of wildlife that crosses successfully under that bridge. So that's one structure. I showed you the Waterville structure where the Appalachian Trail crosses under I-40. That's not really designed for wildlife. It's not designed for wildlife at all, but is being used to some extent. We do have mortality right around that spot quite a bit. We have two box culverts. One where I showed you the elk moving under, and another one about a mile further away. And then each one of these 5 bridges that are going to be replaced. So there's quite a number of them. Again, the issue is in 1968, they weren't They were thinking about moving water under the highway with culverts, and they were thinking about moving cars under the highway with culverts and roadways at these interchanges. So now that there's a very different situation, we need to think about the wildlife.
You know, one of the other things that you didn't talk about were the costs of these things. I would imagine the big bridges are, you know, got to be huge dollar investments. But some of these smaller improvements on the last slide that you showed, you know, removing riprap and having cattle guards at the exits of the highway and fencing and whatnot, that's clearly a considerably cheaper investment in an interchange, right?
Absolutely, and we're trying to nail down the costs there. It looks like the costs for incorporating the changes we want, less the fencing, it's maybe somewhere around $500,000. We don't have a cost estimate on the fencing yet, but we're working with the DOT and we're trying to get there. Larger structures can cost, you know, upwards of $10 million for a single structure. One thing I really want to state clearly is that at times it's actually more costly not to mitigate than it is to mitigate. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's think about it this way. If you have a hot spot where people are hitting large mammals like elk or white-tailed deer, if you have as many as 5 animal strikes with white-tailed deer a year within a single kilometer, it often pays to mitigate, to build a structure, because you can actually estimate the cost in property damage and human injuries over the lifespan of a structure that might be 75 years. And you eliminate all that property damage and human injuries over 75 years. And sometimes it's actually cheaper to build that structure.
How much are those? Because in that case, it sounds like you're talking about building an overpass.
Well, this is all speculative. Let me be really clear. We want to follow the science. So we put together this 2-year project. We have 120 cameras in the right-of-way. As I mentioned to you earlier before we started the presentation, we lost 19 so far. Some of them were shot, some of them were stolen. That's the cost of doing business. We're putting wildlife cameras out on public lands. People come across them. Some people leave them. Some people aren't so kind. But we're wrapping up that research, and we'll be soon, in about another month or so, start to remove those cameras and analyze the data that we have. And that data is going to inform our recommendations to the DOT. So I don't want to get out in front here and say we know what we need to do. Those, you know, more shall be revealed in 2021 as we start to really pour into the data, analyze it, and we already know where the problems are, where things are not successfully crossing. We might not know where things are successfully crossing. That's, you know, if there's no carcass. Let me be clear about another thing. I mentioned earlier that wildlife is moving towards the poles, so moving north. So at some point in time, I-40 right now has 26,000 vehicles a day on average. In another 10 or 15 years, that could be 40,000 vehicles a day. At some point, it's going to become a hard barrier where nothing will even attempt to cross, because it's just the light, the noise, animals will not attempt. And that's something called the barrier effect. And when nothing is being killed because nothing is attempting to cross, it's actually a bigger problem than if animals are getting killed, because now you have a barrier in a warming world, and things can't get to the other side. And that's a huge problem.
You know, there was the Department of Environmental, quite honestly, I'm not sure. I think it was, I know it was a Utah video that here recently was in the news of a passageway, an overpass that they built. It's got big boulders and rocks and whatnot on it, and there were some all sorts of different creatures videoed going over it. And some of the comments that people had, of course, majority of them were very positive. But one of the questions that was posed there that I'm kind of curious about is, so do predators wait for smaller, because we saw all the pictures you showed seem all the animals were moving along pretty quick. Those bears seem to be moving through the camera area quite quickly, but are predators waiting?
Sure. Great question. So that's a question that Tony Clevenger, our road ecologist, answered. He lives in Canmore, Alberta, Canada, and has been monitoring the structures in Banff National Park for the last 18 years. And his data clearly shows that predators do not wait. There is not predator traps. They do have images of wolves chasing a moose at one point. There's another image of a wolf with like a leg of an ungulate moving through there, but there's been no evidence whatsoever that these serve as traps for mountain lions and grizzly bears and other predators to prey upon wildlife moving through structures. If for the folks on here, if you haven't seen that video from the crossing structure on Interstate 80 near Park City, Utah, there's a little timestamp, and it's like day after day. It's like a bobcat, mountain lion, moose, mule deer, ground squirrel, critters big and small, just one after another. It's truly amazing. And that video, thankfully, has gone viral, and people are super excited about it.
Yeah, it was when I went to go look, because I did see it on social media, and our local news channel had it. It seemed that all over the country, all the news channels picked it up.
Let me be really clear, and again, I'll reference Tony Clevenger because I'm a facilitator. I'm an organizer. I bring people together. I spent 20 years in the IT industry working for the phone company. I'm not a wildlife biologist. I'm good at bringing people together and keeping the conversation going. Tony, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Gosh. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's been a long day and I lost my train of thought.
That's all right. There was something else that someone had asked me to ask, which is, how long does it take to decide on locations for these passes?
Really good point. So again, it's collaborative in nature. We're going to follow the science. We've got some ideas. There needs to be some geological study. We need to know, will the underlying geology hold up or will it slide? And will the structure not hold? So those sort of feasibility studies need to be taken into consideration. When I took Tony for the first time into the project area, there's a spot just east of the double tunnel where the eastbound lane of I-40, both lanes are tunneled under the mountain, and the westbound lanes are not. And we have cameras up above that, what we call the single tunnel, because it's only tunneled in one direction. And there's all kinds of wildlife up there. It's absolutely incredible. Lots of bear, bobcat, all kinds of animals. And Tony said, hey, look at this. If you could build a structure here and just span the two eastbound lanes, that's a much less cost investment. It's easier to engineer than it would be to try to span all four lanes. So that's an area that was hypothetically thrown out there. It just so happens that, we also have cameras on both sides of the road. Lots of wildlife are encroaching there. And it's a mortality hotspot. So could that be a spot? It might be. Sometime in 2021, we are going to come out with some recommendations for the DOT, what we'd like to see. And then at that point in time, we might, in 2022, look forward to some sort of a design workshop where we bring some professionals in and start talking about, well, what might work in the locations where you'd like to see some change. And so more, like I said earlier, more shall be revealed. We need to follow the science and we need to work together and in good faith and be solution oriented.
Well, Jeff, I tell you, I really appreciate hearing you talk to us tonight, and I'm sure I speak for all the attendees. There have been a couple of comments saying that it's a great presentation, and they appreciate the effort and thought going into this. You being from a facilitator standpoint, trying to bring everybody together, the number of organizations and jurisdictions that that have not only budgets, but then also input on what they think, without considering wildlife for so long. That's what the North Carolina Wildlife Federation tries to educate folks, is just in their daily raking their leaves. There's wildlife and their eggs, and that's habitat. So there's so much that we go and do on a daily basis, and certainly screaming down the highway at 75 miles an hour, you don't quite realize what's on either side of the road. Hopefully, we don't get into an accident, but we certainly appreciate what your efforts are. You did mention one thing earlier, and that there isn't really a call to action. But is there anything that we could do, any effort other than, paying attention more as we're driving through those areas now that we know where it's really hot? But
Sure. First of all, if you're on the Blue Ridge Parkway, or if you're in the Smokies, if you're in bear habitat, if you're in a park, do the speed limit, please. Speeding kills bears. You'll see those signs in Yosemite. It's really hard to stop if you're doing the speed limit often. In the case of the Parkway, it's 45 miles an hour. You're doing 55, your chances of stopping are greatly decreased. So that's one thing you can do. Support local conservation. Continue to support the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. Today's Giving Tuesday. Support the organizations that are doing the kind of work that speaks to you. Nonprofit organizations are dependent upon, membership and donations. Support folks. If I can, Kim O'Shea asked a question about our armadillos. Do we have a second to address that? Or are we out of time?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Go ahead.
So regarding armadillos, when I lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, from 2003 to 2013, for 10 years, we started to see them. They'd moved in from the west. They've long been in, West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. They're expanding their range eastward and northward. So they're coming from the west. They're now in Western Tennessee. One of the cool things is when my biologist, Steve, first started seeing some of these animals, he was wondering what was going on, because they had leaves. To be crass, he said, it looks like they have leaves in their butt. No, they have prehensile tails, and they would grab leaves to create a nest. So we've seen them in Tennessee. We've seen them in Western North Carolina. They're here. They're going to continue to expand their range. And it's just one more critter in our quiver here in this great state.
I know we had a similar thing with the coyotes. We had a presenter on coyotes, and it took a while for coyotes to make it into the Charlotte region in the Piedmont due to geography and geology considerations, but they're here. So I wonder, you said you're not a biologist, so I kind of left that question off, but I appreciate you answering that for us.
Sure. Let me just say that I'm a voracious reader, and when I work for the phone company, let's suffice to say that it wasn't, there was an empty space that the phone company wasn't filling. So I was doing a lot of volunteer work and learning. I got an undergraduate degree in environmental studies. So I know a great deal because I took the initiative to learn, and I spend time with folks like yourselves and Kim DeLozier and others who are far more knowledgeable. And I'm just grateful to be able to do this work here in the Asheville vicinity, because it's it's a dream come true for me, and so hopefully we can make some real changes for wildlife, make it a better place for people and wildlife.
Indeed, Jeff, and that's actually the best part about being able to have these meetings on Zoom, you have folks from all over the country being able to learn about things that aren't necessarily in their backyard, but maybe coming to their backyard. So very much appreciate you speaking with us tonight. And thanks for everybody attending tonight as well. Check out our website, hawkncwf.org, and us on Facebook as well. Thanks again, Jeff. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.